The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. Inside was a bill from our homeowners association for $25,000, with a single line explaining the charge. Unapproved permanent recreational structure, basketball hoop. I stood there in my kitchen, holding this absurd piece of paper, wondering how a simple basketball hoop could possibly cost more than my car. Have you ever dealt with an unfair HOA or difficult neighbor? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear it. My name is Mark, and in 1998, my family and I had been living in Willow Creek Estates for 3 years. It was one of those picture-perfect suburban developments where every house looked vaguely similar. Every lawn was meticulously maintained, and every resident was expected to follow the community's extensive rule book. For the most part, I didn't mind the rules. They kept property values up and the neighborhood looking nice. The basketball hoop in question was nothing special, a standard pole-mounted system I'd installed myself in our driveway. My son Michael had just made the high school basketball team, and my daughter Sarah was showing real interest in the sport too. As a former high school basketball coach, I couldn't have been prouder. The hoop became a gathering place, not just for my kids, but for neighborhood children who would come over to shoot around. What would you have done in my place? Fight back or walk away? The first notice about the hoop came about 6 months after I installed it. A friendly letter from the HOA mentioned that permanent recreational structures required prior approval. I called the office, explained that the hoop could be removed, if necessary, and was told to submit a retroactive application. I did so immediately, including photos and a letter from several neighbors who had no issue with the hoop. Weeks passed with no response. Meanwhile, I noticed at least 3 other basketball hoops in the neighborhood, some even more elaborate than mine. When I mentioned this to the HOA president, Barbara Henderson, at a community meeting, she simply smiled and said, "We'll get to your application in due time." Barbara was the kind of woman who seemed to take personal pleasure in enforcing Willow Creek's rules. She'd lived in the community since its founding and treated the HOA guidelines as if they were sacred texts handed down from on high. Her husband, Frank, was the vice president, and together they ran the HOA like their personal fiefdom. Rules are rules, whether you like them or not, Barbara had told me more than once. 2 months after my initial application, I received another letter, this one stating that my application had been denied. The reason: permanent structures are not permitted in front yards. I was confused, since my driveway was technically side yard, not front yard. When I called to clarify, I was told that driveways are considered part of the front-facing property. I had no idea the next letter in my mailbox would change everything. It was the $25,000 fine that crossed the line. The letter cited a continuing violation fee of $500 per day since the initial notice. By their calculation, I had been in violation for 50 days, hence the astronomical amount. When I called to dispute this, Barbara Henderson was cold and uncompromising. "The fine stands, Mark. You were given ample opportunity to comply." "This is ridiculous, Barbara. There are basketball hoops all over this neighborhood. Those were approved," she said simply. "How can that be? The rule says no permanent structures. Some received variances. Others were installed before the current rules were in place." I felt my blood pressure rising. "So you're telling me that rules apply to some people, but not others?" "Rules are rules, Mark, whether you like them or not." I hung up the phone, frustrated but determined. That weekend, I drove around the neighborhood and took pictures of every basketball hoop I could find, 7 in total. Some were clearly older, but at least two looked newer than mine. I also noted other permanent structures that seemed to violate HOA rules: decorative lawn ornaments, permanent gazebos, even a small shed that one neighbor had built without approval. Monday morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer recommended by a friend. Tom Reynolds specialized in property law and had dealt with HOA disputes before. When I showed him the letters and the photos, he whistled softly. $25,000 for a basketball hoop. That's not just excessive, it's potentially illegal under state law. Can they really do this? I asked. Tom leaned back in his chair. HOAs have broad powers, but they can't act arbitrarily or discriminatorily, and they definitely can't impose fines that are clearly unreasonable. Over the next few weeks, Tom helped me gather evidence. We submitted formal requests for HOA records, including applications and approvals for other basketball hoops. We also requested meeting minutes where these decisions might have been discussed. The HOA stalled, claiming the records were being archived. This delay only strengthened our case. Illinois law required HOAs to provide such records within a reasonable time frame. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA intensified. I received threatening letters about placing a lien on my home. Barbara Henderson began making pointed comments to other neighbors about my disregard for community standards. Some friends started distancing themselves, worried about getting caught in the crossfire. What would you have done in my place? Fight back or walk away? The false hope came about 2 months into the dispute. Frank Henderson, Barbara's husband, and the HOA vice president approached me after a community meeting. "Mark, can we talk?" he asked, leading me away from the crowd. "Look, Barbara can be intense about these things, but we don't want this to escalate. How about we reduce the fine to $5,000 if you remove the hoop and drop any challenges?" Seemed like a reasonable compromise, and for a moment I considered it. But something felt off. Why the sudden change of heart, and why was Frank approaching me instead of Barbara? "I'll think about it," I said cautiously. That night I discussed it with my wife, Lisa. "It's still $5,000 for a basketball hoop," she pointed out. "And what about the other hoops in the neighborhood? They're not being fined." The next day, I called Tom to discuss the offer. His response was immediate. "Don't take it. If they're offering to reduce it by $20,000, they know their position is weak, and if you settle now, you'll never get to the bottom of why they're targeting you specifically." Tom was right. I rejected Frank's offer, and the HOA's response was immediate and vindictive. They initiated foreclosure proceedings based on the alleged debt. The lawsuit we filed wasn't just about the basketball hoop or the excessive fine. We sued for discrimination, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also named Barbara and Frank Henderson personally, alleging they were using their positions to target specific residents. The discovery process was eye-opening. We obtained documents showing that the Hendersons had selectively enforced rules against residents they personally disliked while granting favors to friends. One neighbor, a close friend of Barbara's, had built an unapproved deck that was clearly in violation of HOA rules. Yet not only was he not fined, but his violation was retroactively approved. Most damning were the meeting minutes where my case was discussed. Barbara had made comments about not wanting certain types of recreational equipment in the neighborhood, and Frank had specifically mentioned my defiant attitude as a reason to make an example of me. I had no idea the next letter in my mailbox would change everything. As the court date approached, the HOA's lawyer approached us with a new settlement offer: complete forgiveness of the fine, removal of all violations from my record, and a formal apology. But by this point it wasn't about the money or the basketball hoop anymore. It was about principle. "We'll see them in court," Tom told them. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified about the installation of the hoop, my attempts to comply with HOA procedures, and the increasingly hostile response from the board. Tom presented evidence of selective enforcement, including the photos of other basketball hoops and unapproved structures that had been ignored. The HOA's lawyer argued that they had the right to enforce their rules as they saw fit, and that the fines were clearly outlined in the community bylaws. But when pressed on why similar violations by other residents had been ignored, he could provide no satisfactory explanation. Barbara Henderson testified that she had no personal animosity toward me and that the HOA was simply following procedures. But under cross-examination, she became flustered when confronted with the meeting minutes and the preferential treatment given to her friends. The turning point came when Tom called a former HOA board member to testify. She revealed that the Hendersons had systematically used their positions to punish residents they disliked while overlooking violations by their friends. She also testified that the $500 daily fine had been invented specifically for my case. With no precedent in HOA history, the judge's ruling was decisive. Not only did he throw out the $25,000 fine, but he found that the HOA had acted arbitrarily, discriminatorily, and in bad faith. He awarded me $50,000 in damages, enough to cover my legal fees with money left over, and ordered the HOA to reform its procedures. But the poetic justice came in the form of additional requirements. The Hendersons were removed from their positions and barred from serving on the HOA board for 5 years. The HOA was required to send a formal apology to every homeowner, detailing their misconduct. And most satisfyingly, they were ordered to establish a clear, fair process for approving basketball hoops, with my application to be the first one approved under the new system. The aftermath was almost as satisfying as the victory. Several other homeowners came forward with stories of similar treatment by the Hendersons. Within months, the entire HOA board had been replaced by residents committed to fair and reasonable governance. My basketball hoop stayed right where it was, becoming something of a neighborhood landmark. Kids from all over Willow Creek Estates came to shoot hoops, and I even started coaching a small weekend clinic for neighborhood children. A year after the court decision, I ran into Barbara Henderson at the grocery store. She looked older, diminished, somehow. She hesitated, then approached me. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for how I handled things. It was wrong." I nodded. "Thank you for saying that. I hope the new board is doing better." She managed a small smile. "They are. It's for the best." As I watched her walk away, I felt not triumph, but satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the system working as it should. The basketball hoop that had caused so much trouble had become a symbol of standing up for what's right. In the end, they buried themselves in their own arrogance. "What's the sweetest justice you've ever seen?"